Now this is the second part of Lecture 9, and I want to just mention a couple things here right off the bat that I didn't mention last time that I wanted to bring you up to speed on. One was I talked quite a bit about the T-34 tank, about how it was such a wonderful tank and by far the best tank of the entire Second World War. I should have mentioned also the Soviet fighter plane called Il-2 or Ilyushin-2 or Sturmovik. Now this turned out to be by far the best fighter, or in U.S. parlance, fighter-bomber plane of the entire Second World War. And it was unusual in this sense. It had the pilot was completely protected with a one-piece steel cast frontal assembly, so that it was almost impossible to penetrate that steel. Now, that would have been too heavy for a fighter plane overall. So the rear half of the Sturmovik was built out of wood. So you had a lightweight and a very heavy, what were originally called aerial tanks. So that would be coming at you, and which you couldn't shoot down. And it also had, well, not easily anyway, and it also had gasoline tanks, which were made to be in such a way that what they were called self-sealing fuel tanks. They're full of a rubber-like inner tube, and as the fuel is used up, that expanded inner tube shrinks down, and so you don't have a lot of highly volatile gasoline up there in those propeller engines. Now, because propeller planes require a high octane gasoline, which is, you put one bullet into a gas tank with that, and that's going to blow up the whole plane itself. So you had to have these self-sealing tanks. But once you had those, then you could use high octane aviation fuel, and your pilot was perfectly safe because he couldn't be shot down from the ground or the air without a great deal of luck. So this airplane, the Sturmovik, was the most important thing next to T-34 tank that won World War II for us. And it was mass producible in these secret factories Stalin built behind the Urals. All right, that was one thing I wanted to mention. And then one final thing about the last year preceding Stalin's death in early 1953. The Americans had blown up their hydrogen bomb on November 1st in 1952 in the South Pacific. But and they bragged about that, but what Stalin knew, and what much of the world did not know, was that what they had blown up was a 70-ton bomb in a building the size of a skyscraper on this island. That was in no way a militarily usable weapon. There was no plane then or now that could lift 70 tons and a skyscraper along with it. So what did happen, and which was unusual, was whereas Stalin had told his atomic scientists to just exactly duplicate what the Americans had done to produce the original atomic bomb that the Soviets exploded in the fall of 1949, but now he had given them free rein to develop their own hydrogen bomb any way they wanted to do it. And they had come up with a way that was quite different and better than what the Americans were doing. And consequently, Stalin was told in early 1953 on New Year's Day that he would soon have the world's first usable hydrogen bomb. Now, he died that spring, but the important thing here is that the Russians went ahead and completed their work there. They dropped their first militarily deliverable hydrogen bomb from an airplane 20 months after August 12, 1953, 9 months after that actually, and that was before the U.S. had developed a militarily deliverable hydrogen bomb. Now, the United States had already been checkmated in Korea. So that is, they had gotten as far as they were going to get without going into that at this particular time. The important thing is that there was no easy way for the U.S. now to attack the Soviet Union. First of all, it had atomic bombs, hydrogen bombs, a buffer of East European people's democracies, and now the buffer of the People's Republic of China, which was certainly a friendly government in China on the other side. So even if the Americans had more atomic bombs than the Russians, they didn't have any way of getting to Russia. They couldn't get on their frontiers anymore, and or even close to their frontiers. So they were. Now the other thing is, by 1940 or 1950, right now the U.S. and the Soviet Union produce, U.S. and Russia produce about 4 atomic warheads per day. Per week, I'm sorry, and that is quite a bit, because that means you can bring in your newer models and replace your older ones, but it also shows you pretty much the par upon which the U.S. and Russia are on right now. Another reason why the U.S. is trying so hard to get its forward bases up against Soviet frontiers, and another reason why they're trying so hard to get the Ukraine, in which was traditional Soviet territory, into some kind of NATO situation. And it looks like that's going to be an utter catastrophe as of today, which is, we're pretty close to the end of summer, and I don't see that this government in Kiev can last more than another couple months at best. So we'll see how that plays out. At any rate, the U.S. imperialism was on a rampage after 1945 as far as Latin America is concerned. And the first place that played out in practice was in Guatemala. Now, in your book, on chapter 17, we'll go through some of this stuff, but what happened in Guatemala was that there was a relatively mild-mannered country gentleman kind of reformer named Jacobo Arbenz, who had been elected president in the first democratic elections ever held in Guatemala, and the U.S. had decided he had to be overthrown because he was far too left to their liking, and so they began to put together a program to bring in a fascist regime, which they ushered in under a man named Colonel Castillo Armas, who they armed and trained and supplied with everything he needed out of their base in Honduras, which is still a U.S. base for practical purposes. It's the one place where they have succeeded in recent years in overthrowing the locally elected democratic government and putting in another one of their fascist thugs. But all that is to show you that how far reduced their influence in this hemisphere has been, because Honduras was always their property, and if that's the only thing they've got left, which it pretty much is, because their alliance with the Colombians is starting to come apart. At any rate, they managed to overthrow the Arbenz government, but in the process of doing it, Arbenz wrote a book called The Shark and the Sardines, where he described Guatemala's traditional position with regard to the United States. So far from God, so close to the United States, I think is how he described it. But at any rate, the book was written about this entire incident. It's probably worth your time taking a look at. More importantly, at this time, Che Guevara travels on his second trip to Latin America. He has become a doctor now, and he's in Guatemala trying to help the government there in terms of their medical program for all of these poor farmers who've never seen a doctor before in their life. And the U.S. wants to be sure they never see one in the future either. At any rate, he gets to witness this entire overthrow of the Arbenz regime. And he flees with his Peruvian wife to Mexico City. And in Mexico City, Che Guevara meets Raul Castro and then later Fidel Castro. And Guevara has already learned his lessons about what's really going on in the Western Hemisphere by his 2 trips through South America and his experiences in Guatemala. So by the time he meets the Castro brothers, he's more than welcome to join their crusade against Batista back in Cuba. So this turns out to be one of the first confrontations of the Cold War, authentic confrontations between communism and U.S. imperialism that the Americans lose outright, assuming that they had already lost the Korean War for practical purposes, but not one that they understood as well as they should have. At any rate, what happens in Cuba, or in the Cuban situation, is that Fidel welcomes Che Guevara on board with the 26th of July movement as their medic, their doctor. And that's how he starts out. But he goes through the same boot camp that everybody else goes through, which is on a ranch outside of Mexico City. And here he's hired a man to train his fellows in guerrilla warfare and how to do it. And then from there they're going to take off and invade Cuba. And I've gone through that story extensively in the next year's edition of the ABCs of Communism in Chapter 31 on the Cuban Revolution, but I'll go ahead and give you a little more introduction to it today based on what's also in your textbook right now. And I want to get up here to the part about what the U.S. is doing inside Latin America. Now, the first thing that the Meyer-Lansky gang had to do was to get Truman squared away as with regard to his entire administration. And so the atomic bomb was unknown to Truman when he took office. So he was read into the entire program, explained what it was all about. They still had to finish the war with Japan, but this bunch thought that they could do it right away. And they had to do it right away because the Red Army was on its way to Japan, as per agreement with the U.S. and it asked them to come in and help. Because when Roosevelt had made that deal with Stalin, what Roosevelt was looking at was the possibility that a full-scale invasion of the Japanese islands would cost 1 million American lives. And if he could get Stalin to help the same way they had helped in storming Berlin, that had cost the Russians 250,000 lives, he wanted to do that, and Stalin had agreed to help him. So he was in the war. But in order to wind this thing down, you had to knock the Japs out of the war real quick, so Truman decided to drop these two bombs on Japan. The Emperor, looking at what his fate would be if he continued, decided to throw in the towel, and so that was the end of that, and Japan surrendered. Now, but there were other things going on in the New World which were just as important as anything that would happen in the Japanese sphere or in Europe. And so we are going to take a quick look at those things right now, beginning with the Cuban Revolution. Because the Cuban Revolution, in a sense, reinvigorated the Soviet control over the international communist movement, in the sense that by coming to Fidel Castro's assistance in 1959, Khrushchev, who was the leader of the new revisionist group, an essentially anti-Stalin kind of group, and Stalin was dead, of course, back in the Soviet Union, were able to renew their revolutionary credentials because everybody knew that Fidel Castro by this time, by the end of 1959, for example, was an authentic revolutionary. Everything he had promised to the Cuban people had been carried out. They'd had a land reform. Every peasant got at least 66 2/3 acres of land. They had cut rents in half. They had abolished fees for telephones and trains. And, I mean, one kind of social program after another that he had promised them had been introduced. So Castro had all kinds of revolutionary credentials. And as secret connections between the Russians and the Cubans developed in 1960, they had all kinds of secret connections too. And they already knew that Fidel's brother Raul was a communist and had been since before the days he had joined with Fidel to overthrow Batista with the 26th of July movement rebel army. They knew that lots of the high-ranking people in the 26th of July movement were also communists, and so they had high hopes because Fidel made it clear to them in these secret meetings that he was going to become a communist too. He just hadn't decided the time to announce it. And he also made it clear that he was not going to be a person who followed the Cuban Communist Party's lead because he didn't have much respect for their history of leadership, and that they were going to follow his lead, and they concurred with that. So there are a couple movies that have been made about this that are well worth your time, but the best one by far is a Showtime movie produced 12 years ago called Fidel, which you could probably get at Amazon. There's another one called Che Part 1 and Che Part 2. Che Part 1 is about Cuba. Che Part 2 is about how Che got murdered in Bolivia. That's on Netflix, so I know you can see that one there. Both of these will give you some important visual insights into the way in which this Cuban Revolution was developing. Now, the Cuban Revolution, for me, has a special significance because I was just getting old enough to participate directly in something like this. I'll give you an idea of what I mean. About 2 weeks after my 16th birthday in 1958, I took off from home and hitchhiking to, well, I was going to go to Key West and then get on a ferry and go across to Havana. In those days, you had a ferry leaving every hour out of Key West, and it's of course a short distance, some 90 miles to Havana. Tremendous amount of tourist traffic going back and forth in those days, so that part would be easy. We had put together a group at Boise of students that I talk about a little bit in the book. I won't go into all of the details right here, but some of those people are dead now, and some are still alive, but the important, or barely, like me, the important thing was that we had decided that we would go one by one to Havana, and I was the one who went first, since a lot of this had been my idea ever since my uncle and aunt had been in Havana for the January of that year for the General Motors Convention. And when they got back to Idaho, my aunt Elva told me that she couldn't even eat because there were so many poor people hanging on the gates around Batista's summer palace, and it just made her sick. So they also told us about the guerrilla uprising that was going on there. And about this time, we'd been seeing on TV some CBS reporters had managed to get back into Oriente, where the Civil War was going on, and interview Fidel directly. And it was kind of a romantic cause for a young person my age or our age to get involved in, and it was non-communist according to everybody that was reporting on it. And so at that moment, as a matter of fact, in the press anyway, Fidel Castro was still a pretty admirable figure in the United States. So that I got picked up on an FBI roadblock out of Wichita and sent back to the States. And the whole story there, sent back to Idaho. So the whole story is in there. But at any rate, I'd gotten involved, and I was watching the whole situation closely. I don't think anybody in Idaho was watching it as closely as I was on the at midnight. I remember the night of New Year's Eve of 1958 because I was depressed. The radio broadcasting the news was saying that Fidel Castro had been and Che Guevara had been defeated in their drive on Santa Ana, and the government was restoring order in the island. So I was pretty depressed that night. In the morning, the headline of the Idaho Statesman was, "Batista flees Cuba, Fidel takes the island," something like that. So anyway, that was a shockingly good piece of news for me. Now, that began the long transition, which almost led to World War III a couple of years later. But by that time, I was in Mexico City on my way to Havana. That's another story that we'll pick up at a later time. Okay, what else was going on in the world that was causing problems for the new U.S. ruling oligarchy? One important member of which, of course, now is Meyer Lansky. The other thing that was really going on was that in Vietnam there was a successful revolution going forth. Now, originally, this Ho Chi Minh was already an old man by the time that this was starting, because he had gone to Paris in 1920, and he had become a member of the Communist movement, and he had started an armed struggle there with a fellow named Giap, G-I-A-P, to force out the Japanese prior to the end of the war. And then he had established, as soon as that happened, his group, which had become a larger movement, the National Liberation Front, including other people besides communists, was successful in establishing a government, post-Japanese occupation government, in Hanoi. So, but you'll recall that Truman had reversed FDR's foreign policy as quickly as he could after he took over. So now, instead of doing what FDR had said he would do, which was in no way help the French retake Indochina, Truman said, well, we'll be happy to help you retake Indochina. So they did. And the French re-invaded, and they managed to retake Hanoi, and the Ho Chi Minh government had to retreat into the mountains to the north. Now that wasn't such a bad thing after all, because now they had the Chinese People's Republic of China, the Chinese Communist Party, butting right up on their northern frontiers. So they had an unlimited amount of supplies and advisors they could bring in there, and they had a base area that their people that had been shot or sick or that they wanted trained could retreat into. So the French had, yes, gained Hanoi, and they had the tentative support of the United States, but they hadn't really gained very much. They weren't going to be able to hold on to it. Most of you know that what happened is that the North Vietnamese National Liberation Front under Ho Chi Minh and the Communist Party's leadership managed to isolate the French in a place called Dien Bien Phu out to the western part of Vietnam, North Vietnam, and there they caught them and destroyed them completely. Caught them in a classical trap from which they could not extricate themselves. And there used to be a movie on Netflix called Dien Bien Phu, and I think now you have to get it on disc, but maybe Amazon has it, which is a very good documentary. It takes you step by step through how the communists trapped the French army up there and wiped them out. So that was the end of French in Vietnam. They withdrew, but the Americans stepped in and picked up the gauntlet immediately. And they set up a puppet government of their own in South Vietnam, and they canceled the national elections that were supposed to be held because they knew Ho Chi Minh would win those elections. And so they set themselves up for what we were going to know as our Vietnam War. Now, the next thing we want to take a look at here is, well, these two revolutions in Cuba and Vietnam began to preoccupy the U.S. ruling class. I think most of us would say that once they had assassinated JFK and put in their own guy, LBJ, then they thought that they were going to be able to wrap up one and then the other. They weren't ever able to wrap up the Cuban Revolution or the Vietnamese Revolution, and they took a severe beating and a series of backwards steps. Time that I could participate in what was happening in the United States and in Mexico with regard to at least the Cuban part of this thing. And I can tell you that what we had in the U.S. was a rapidly growing anti-war movement, which was under the leadership of one or the other of the left parties, meaning the old CPUSA, under the leadership of Gus Hall and Khrushchev type of revisionists at the time, Progressive Labor Party, which was the Chinese-lining part of the old CPUSA, renamed as Progressive Labor, and it had its own leaders who had also come out of the Central Committee of the CPUSA, but had decided to go with China rather than with the revisionist Khrushchev. And the SWP, which was Socialist Workers' Party, was the original Trotskyist party of the United States. Now, in Oregon, where I had started out, Oregon was one district, and Idaho, Washington was another district of both the old CPUSA. And those two districts were considered to be the most left-wing districts within the Communist Party. The PLP was not in Oregon at all, so all of the leadership of the anti-war movement that was done in Oregon was done by us, that is, the Communist Party, but we were the far left wing of the Communist Party on a national basis. So I've talked a little bit about how we got that thing started in the right direction, the anti-war movement in Oregon. Well, by the time I got to Los Angeles, I still didn't have ties with PLP, but what I did do was to join the Los Angeles Committee, Anti-War Committee, and it was under the leadership of the traditional Trotskyist Socialist Workers' Party youth wing, YSA, Young Socialist Alliance. So these were people my own age, and they had the SWP doctrine down pretty well, and but they were the only ones that were leading an effective anti-war movement in Los Angeles. The CPUSA had their peace movement. We had our anti-Vietnam War movement. Two quite different things as far as communists are concerned. With the anti-war movement, I don't have the same kind of insight from experience. But one of the things I can see that's different about today is that you have a lot more anarchists in the process, which is to be expected. Because in the years following the defeat of the U.S. in Vietnam, the anti-war movement quickly died. As the U.S. rulers knew it would if they were able to get out of that thing and end the draft, because the major opposition to the brought out masses of people to our demonstrations in the U.S. against the war had been the draft, and the fact that all kinds of young men who had no interest in fighting this war were getting killed for these so-called principles of democracy in Vietnam. They didn't want to go, and they weren't going to go. And so all kinds of things happened, all kinds of forms of resistance. A bunch of them fled to Canada. There was one fellow from the States who fled to Canada in our Department of Archaeology when I was getting my PhD there. That wasn't uncommon. Americans were fleeing up there from everywhere. What was uncommon was somebody like me who'd already been in the Army and was getting a check on the GI Bill every month that was up there. But at any rate, today you have a lot more of these anarchists around because the CPUSA is effectively non-existent. What's left of it is just an FBI front organization. PLP kind of, I would guess they probably have about 60 members in the United States overall by now. SWP, as far as I can tell, it's just about completely gone, but it has given rise to a couple more of Trotskyist parties, one called the Party of Peace and, what is it called? Party of Socialism and Liberation, and another one called Workers' World. We talk about about this sort of thing in the party, but so this new anti-war movement has not yet taken on the kind of political consciousness that the old anti-war movement had, primarily because it's got anarchists and a motley assortment of old guys like me that are standing on the sidelines cheerleading for them. That isn't going to do the job, but on the other hand, we didn't do the job either when it was our time, so we're going to have to wait and see what the working class movement kicks up with regard to the contemporary anti-war movement that centers what we do really know a lot about is exactly what the plans of the imperialists are with regard to Arabia, the Ukraine, and Russia and China. We know because they've been telling us for years on the White House website and in their so-called academic papers. Mr. Wolfowitz and Mr. Kagan are vying with each other to get the credit for who came up with this idea of controlling the world by blocking China, Russia, and Iran. Well, so far none of this is working for them, but it doesn't seem to have changed their commitment to pursuing it. I guess probably what we see here, I see they gave Obama some homework here a couple months ago to read one of Kagan's papers, and people asked him about it. He said, "Oh yeah, I've been reading this stuff," and I'm thinking, I'm sure you have been. I'm sure you and the Rockefellers have been reading this, trying to figure out how you got into this goddamn mess to begin with. But once you do understand how you got into it and why it won't work, then you're faced with the real problem. Where are you going after that? So we don't know. Anyhow, but what we do know is this. By the time going back in time, the Cubans took their revolutionary force of 80-odd men onto a boat which should never have made it, called the Granma, Granma, a famous name now in Cuba and Cuban history. That's also the name of the daily newspaper you can get online in 5 languages, including English. That's Granma, which is the daily newspaper of the Political Bureau of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Cuba. But Granma was a boat. They got 80-odd men on there and their weapons, and they headed for Cuba, and they got stalled in a hurricane or a tropical storm. It almost sank, but it didn't, and they managed to eventually get there, but they got there late, and they got there so late that the people that were waiting for them decided that they must have gone somewhere else or they were lost at sea, and so Celia Sanchez was leading that reception group. Her picture is on Cuban money now. She became a great heroine of the Cuban Revolution and Fidel Castro's wife until she died around 1970 from cigarette smoking. I think, lung cancer. And she was a chain smoker, so that all makes sense. And you'll get to see some of that in the movie Fidel, where they have a very pretty actress playing her part. Not that she wasn't pretty, but I mean, she was. But anyway, I think you'll enjoy watching that movie. So they managed to get ashore. They got ambushed within a day by Batista forces who tried to kill them all while they were sleeping in a cane field. And they did kill most of them, but a few got away. And about 11 of them eventually met up in the Sierra Maestra Mountains. But they had nothing. They had no weapons, money, food, nothing. And when I first interviewed Carlos Prieto about this meeting, he had just come back from meeting with Fidel Castro and Che Guevara and some of the others, and he said, they told me that Fidel and when Che Guevara walked into the room, into this meeting clearing area up in the mountains he said Fidel told him that the days of the dictatorship are numbered, and he said everybody was looking around him because there's only 11 of us left alive, and we don't have any money, we don't have any food, we don't have any guns, so blah 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 blah. But as far as Fidel was concerned, the most difficult part had been accomplished. They'd gotten into the Sierras and they were ready to start the war. This is a man who has no end of personal confidence and radiates that to everybody that he meets, so that even though factually you would think maybe things would look a little bit different, after you talk to this guy, you're thinking, well, he's certainly confident. I guess as long as he feels that way about it, I can too. So this does this kind of psychological power of being a leader, a charismatic leader, is important. All right, from that step forward, the Cubans began a very intelligent series of steps. First, they realized after a while that they needed to get some press, because the Batista forces, which controlled the press completely under the press censorship law. Batista had an outright dictatorship, military dictatorship going, and they had told the press that they had to report that Fidel Castro and his whole group were dead. Besides, they were dead. And the press had been saying this faithfully. Not allowed to send anybody back to Oriente province. All the roads were blocked. And so what the Cubans did was they attacked, and I describe in your book, a government stockade out on the coast, and they whipped them. They took it over. It was real closely fought because they only had so many guns and so many bullets by this time, and so they couldn't just hang out there and shoot away all day long like they do over there in Arabia when they get stopped for some reason. in that pickup war and the wars they've been running over there. But at any rate, so they beat them. And then they gave these soldiers medicine and so on so they could get back to someplace. And they started talking, and pretty soon the word started to spread, even though it was still outlawed to be in the newspapers. The word started to spread among all these poor farmers in Oriente that Fidel Castro and his group were alive, and they were fighting the Batista government. So Fidel then sent a person to Havana to talk to one of the women that he had working for him up there about getting somebody from the U.S. press down to interview him in Oriente province. And she did. She managed to get hold of a New York Times correspondent named Herbert Matthews. Now Matthews, as it turned out, had already been planning on going to Havana for a vacation within the next week or two, so it was easy for him to say yes. The other thing is, Matthews had been a war correspondent in Spain, and he hated fascists anyway, so he wanted to go for that reason too, because this was the first kind of romantic revolutionary war by Spanish-speaking people since the Spanish Civil War. So he was interested for all of these reasons. Now he got to Havana. Celia Sanchez met him and drove him back into Oriente province under cover of being an investor for a big mining company. And you'll see all of this portrayed in that movie Fidel that I was mentioning to you. But the important thing is that once he got there, and Fidel, back in the days when I first met Carlos Prieto, he told me this story. He was going back and forth to Havana all the time, then making a movie about the Cuban Revolution for Fidel, Raúl, and Che Guevara. So he was in virtually daily direct contact with these guys, and I was listening to it almost like it came off the telephone. So what had happened here was that when they got Matthews back here to meet with Fidel, he had about 20 men under arms. So he kept bringing those guys back and forth, but dressed somewhat differently, and addressing him as Comandante, and they were from column number 1 and column number 63, whatever it was. He told Matthews that he had a couple hundred or a couple thousand men throughout Oriente province, and he got his picture taken with Matthews, and so there was no question about whether this was an authentic interview. The important thing is that he convinced Matthews that he had a powerful rebel army and that he was going to bring Batista down right away. Well, the New York Times printed this on their front page for 3 or 4 days running, serialized it with full description of how the Batista government had been lying about what was going on down there, what was really happening in the country, all kinds of photographs. And of course I read this out in Idaho when it had started, so it was one of those things that inspired me to run away to join Fidel. Anyway, this was a big turning point, because, not just because foreigners read about it like me, but because the day before this New York Times interview came out, Batista had felt so secure that he had dropped press censorship. What bad timing for him. The next day, the stuff was on the street corners from the New York Times, and the local Cuban press started to run it. By the time they started the censorship again, it was too late. The entire Cuban nation knew that Fidel Castro and his army were operating out of Oriente, and many of them were just thrilled to death, because the Batista gang was just an outright Meyer Lansky flunky. They were stealing everything from everybody, and not just from the poor people. They were stealing it from other wealthy people too. So there was a lot of anger being developed in the Batista government. So all of this was happening. So it happened all through 1957, 1958, and finally in 1958 the Batistianos made a last-ditch attempt to root the rebels out of the Oriente province. And when I was there, a few years later, when I was in Mexico City a few years later, hearing about this from Carlos Prieto, I had one distinct impression, and that is that the Fidelistas were backing up, Stalin retreat, and taking a pretty heavy toll on them. And in the research I've done since then, which is in chapter 31 of next year's ABCs, I found that to be essentially correct. But the outcome of all of this planning was that Batista made a final push in May, May, and June of 1958, which failed. 50,000 men assembled in total. He couldn't beat a couple thousand guerrillas. So that, when you're outnumbered 50-1, you should not be able to win. And yet by the end of the year, they had cut the island in half because Che Guevara was driving through towards the city of Santa Clara, which was would cut the only road and rail connection between Havana and Santiago. And he was successful, and Fidel took Santiago the same night, which was New Year's Eve of 1958, New Year's Eve, or the next day would be January 1st, 1959, New Year's Day. And by that time, Batista at midnight threw in the towel, decided to go straight to the U.S. and call it a day. He made that announcement at the presidential ball that night, and you'll see a picture of how these people ran for it if you ever watched that movie Godfather 2, because Michael Corleone is in Havana that very night. That's the night he finds out that his brother has been the one betraying him, and that's the night that that Batista says, "Good luck to you all, I'm gone." Boom, and he takes off for Miami. He was too hot for the Americans even in Miami, so eventually he had to pay the Dominican dictator Rafael Trujillo $1 million a day to stay in the Dominican Republic. But he got too hot for Trujillo too, so eventually he ended up on an island off of Portugal and lived off the rest of his life there, died of natural causes. But that was the end of him. It was the end of the Batista dictatorship. During the course, of course, of the 2 years of civil war that Cuba had been fighting, all of 1957, all of 1958, because they had landed in the middle of December 1956. So, and then they had, as you know, gotten wiped out upon landing, and then 11 men had run into the mountains. So pretty cleanly at the beginning of 1957, they start the Civil War. It's 2 years, all of 57, all of 58, that's all it takes, boom. But when I say that's all it takes, all kinds of exciting things happened in that time, but from a political and economic standpoint, the most important thing that happened was that Fidel Castro had built a de facto party out of the 26th of July movement. So when they took the reins in Havana in January, it took him about a week to go from Santiago on a wholly televised tour of Cuba all the way to Havana. Every day, every hour of every day was broadcast live on Cuban television channels. And as far as I know, that's the first such time that a revolution has been televised. It took him 5 days to get there, and Fidel was a man that loved to talk as long as there was anybody who would listen to him, even if there wasn't anybody that would listen to him. And so he talked his whole way up there from Santiago to Havana, speaking to the crowds and making it clear to them that the promises of the revolution were not like the promises that they were used to getting and they'd been hearing all their lives from politicians, which somehow never seemed to come to pass. So, in 1959, this struggle inside Cuba begins to develop between U.S. imperialism and the Cubans. And in the meantime, the Vietnamese Revolution has been taking off too. Now, the Americans have been in there, that is, the CIA has been in there trying to assassinate village leaders and so on, and they have assassinated quite a few of these village leaders. You have people like Mike Morrell, of this intellectual type, if you call it intellectual. I can read and write, and I've had a little bit of historical knowledge, but a little, with the emphasis on little. And they're running these programs called Phoenix, which are to assassinate local leaders of the villages that they think might be friendly to the Viet Cong, that is the communists of South Vietnam. And they're not really getting anywhere. They're just gradually losing ground there. A big argument is taking place inside the U.S. as to whether they need to make a full-fledged commitment. Now, the hard right of the U.S. military, which is all of the chiefs of staff, they want a hard-line military invasion of Cuba right now and boost the U.S. forces, ground forces in South Vietnam to defeat these communists, where the CIA has proven that its program of assassinations isn't working. So, but they have to work that out among themselves. And they won't work it out among themselves until they assassinate Kennedy. Now, once that's done and LBJ's in power, he decides to implement these programs of theirs as far as Vietnam is concerned. But part of the deal about not going to war with Cuba with the Russians has got to have to stay in place. The idea being we can only fight 2 of these wars at one time anyway, so we'll take the Vietnamese first. And once we get wrapped that up, then we can go back and revisit this thing in Cuba. Well, since they lost the thing in Vietnam, there really wasn't anything to revisit the Cuban matter about years later. And besides, by that time, the Khrushchevites had completely adopted the program of protecting Cuba. Not just because for any kind of leftover political sympathies they might have with orthodox Marxism-Leninism, but because their defense of the Cuban Revolution had tremendously revitalized their flagging national credentials. And as a legitimate communist party, as a legitimate leader of the world communist movement. And it's precisely at this time, 1959-1960, that Mao Zedong is making his split with the Soviet revisionist leaderships official, with papers like in defense of Leninism, on the differences between Comrade Toyati and us. And then this is another one of those 40,000 word papers on differences that Peking Review, which is now Beijing Review, is publishing. And then another one more on the differences between Comrade Toyati and us. In other words, all of the arguments of the old Leninist versus revisionist period are now being redone. This time it's Chinese versus Russians inside the international communist movement. So 1959 is a big year in Vietnam, in Cuba, in the international communist movement, and all of this stuff has yet to be worked out, and it is worked out. Now, what we're getting set for here is to understand the years between 1960 and 2000. That is, in the next 40 years, exactly what the Chinese said is going to happen happens. That is, capitalism is restored in the Soviet Union, and China finds itself having to go it alone, and they have to come up with some kind of plan which is going to be more successful than what they've been doing so far from 1949 to 1985. So we're going to go into that in some detail next time around. But I think that for the moment we have done as much as we need to do about the post-World War II period in the Western Hemisphere, in the Asian area of Indochina, and in the European area. If there was one thing I wanted to mention here, it was that Stalin had done everything he could to help the Chinese communists take control of China. Even though U.S. historians have attempted to obfuscate this ever since I was a youth, the truth of the matter is that when the Chinese were driving on kicking Chiang Kai-shek completely out of the country, the Truman administration had threatened to use the atomic bomb on those southwardly moving Chinese, red Chinese columns. And Stalin had told them, well, if you do, well, we're going to take Berlin. So now that turned out to be, that led to what the Americans call a great victory, the Berlin airlift. But what it really was a way of taking heat off of the Chinese, because Stalin didn't quite yet have his atomic bomb explosion. He was only a few weeks away from having it, but he didn't have it. Then when it did happen, the Americans were so set back by that, by the Chinese advances through, the communist advances through China, by Stalin's ability to shut off Berlin anytime he wanted to, that they were finally forced to take a step back. And the next time this question of bombing in Asia comes up with A-bombs is going to be over the Korean matter next year, 1950. Now, at that time, the Koreans had been threatened by Truman with the "we'll drop 5 atomic bombs on all 5 advancing columns." Now, when the British heard this, they said, "Whoa, wait a minute. We're not we're not into using this atomic bomb that way, and there was all kinds of discussions back and forth. Much of it got into the U.S. press at that time about Britain not wanting to get involved on nuclear weapons in Korea, and telling Truman, Attlee told Truman, you do this, you're on your own. We're not going to get involved. So every time he turned around, Truman found that for one way or another, he was blocked. He was either being blocked by the existence of the Chinese Red government, or he was being blocked by the existence of all of these satellite governments in Eastern Europe. They couldn't get close enough to use their atomic bombs, and they didn't yet have any missiles to deliver. Now, the next big surprise that the Americans got was when, a few years later, in 1957, the Russians launched their Sputniks, which showed, first of all, they had the missiles that they could carry bombs to the U.S. if they wanted to, just as easily as they could put a grapefruit-sized satellite into space. And so the combination of these developments led to Truman being removed, Eisenhower replacing him as president in 1952, with the promise that he would bring the boys home from Korea and end the war immediately without any kind of conditions. And Eisenhower pretty much did that. Along the way, he got rid of Wisconsin Senator McCarthy. McCarthy had set himself up as a target by attacking the U.S. Army and its officers as communists. Now, that was about the last straw for General Eisenhower, who he and his officers had just come back from winning World War II in Europe, and they did not appreciate this accusation of McCarthy that they were traitors. So Eisenhower now had won the presidency, and he got rid of McCarthy. The Republicans stripped him in the Senate of what he had in the way of credentials, and he was a few years away from drinking himself to death back home. That was the end of him. So when Eisenhower realized that not only the Russians have the A-bomb, but they've got the missiles, and now a hydrogen bomb on the way, he decided to back off completely on this idea of confronting the Soviet Union and going into World War III. So that is how that particular plan died. But he did fully back the idea of establishing a U.S. hegemony over the Western Hemisphere. And U.S. embassies by 1960 were working overtime to overthrow anything that looked halfway progressive and put in a fascist military dictatorship of some kind in all of the countries south of Mexico. They would have liked to do that in Mexico too, but the Mexican ruling class already had their own fascist dictatorship and they were real happy with it. They didn't want to trade it for a gringo one in its stead. So that's the way things looked as the U.S. established imperial hegemony over the capitalist world, but came up against a hard block with the socialist world at the end of World War II. I think we'll stop right there, and next time we're going to get up into the Chinese Revolution, and then we'll see how we go after that.